in his former capacity as the former Secretary General of the European External Action Service. For those who are not familiar with the EAS, that's basically the EU's foreign policy arm. So we're really honored to have you with us, Ambassador Vimont. And we're looking forward to your thoughts on European policy. Is it time for the EU, for Europe, to rethink its own approach towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Thanks, Hugh, and thank you very much for inviting me here. For those of you who were there a few hours ago, maybe it will sound a little bit like a rehash of some ideas I've put forward an hour ago, but let me try to go again into a more detailed presentation of my thinking about should Europe do a rethink of its Middle East policy. My answer would be, as a good diplomat, yes and no. Yes, because if you look at the past, what is really fascinating, I think, from my point of view, is to see the way the European has shifted from playing an interesting and quite relevant role about 30 or 40 years ago in the whole Middle East peace process to the place where we are today. Think about the 1980s and the 1990s, the Venice Declaration, and then the role that the European Union played in pushing forward rather interesting concepts that have become the mainstream of the thinking with regard to the Middle East process. Self-determination for the Palestinian, the PLO as the natural representative of the Palestinian people. That was a long time ago, but it was still being seen as a major breakthrough. The roadmap, where, and some of you do remember that, Javier Solana, with the help of the EU Special Representative, Moratinos, on this. Europe was there, and the impression one gets thinking about that period is that Europe slowly lost sight of the ball and slowly became some sort of sideline actor for the whole Middle East. And the question then becomes why? Why is it? The quick answer, I think a lot of people would say, is that we've got other priorities. The most obvious one being today the Ukrainian war, but some would add financial crisis, Brexit, migration issues, so on and so forth. My impression is that it is deeper than that and relates precisely to the Middle East and may go back to the whole period of the Arab Spring, the Arab Revolution in different countries, the many crises then unfolded with this Arab Spring crisis, Syria, Libya, Egypt, and others, and the sense and the feeling among Europeans that they were having great difficulty, in fact, in understanding and handling what was going on. We tried just by adapting our southern neighborhood policy, and we thought that was the answer. But it wasn't the answer. Then we tried in other different ways, military intervention in Libya, strong statements here and there with regard to Syria, but it didn't work also. And with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, we slowly, the momentum petered out to some extent. I think many of you have reminded us and mentioned that the latest comprehensive statement about the whole Middle East peace process must date back around 2016 or 2017. Since then, we have issued important statements on current events as they appear, on the need for election, on condemnation of the settlers movement in recent months and recent years. but nothing akin to what was stated at the many important statements that we made at that time. So it's more than that. And the question then becomes, what changed in those years that suddenly made the EU look irrelevant to some extent? And I think my answer to that is that we had a clear understanding of where we were going. We had a strategic concept, a strategic vision of where we wanted to go with regard to the Middle East peace process. It was largely Oslo, of course, but not only. I think it was something more than that. It was about the self-determination of the Palestinian population, the need also to bring stability in the whole region. And because we lost track of those very simple ideas and main political ideas, we were slowly left on the side. And therefore, for me, if we want to revive our policy towards the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but I think, and I'll come back to that in 1 second, I think we need to have a larger geopolitical understanding of what is going on, an understanding of the geopolitical environment that is taking place at the moment. And that is really one of the problems we have to face today, is go back to what we think are our basic principles around this whole issue, stick to it and apply them maybe in a different way from what we have been doing up to now. And this is where I would like very quickly to put 3 or 4 simple ideas. Stick to the principles, first of all, and come back to some clear idea. I was listening to what was said earlier about, is the 2-state solution still a possibility, or is it over? Should we go for a 1-state solution? I would really come back to a very simple idea. It's for the Palestinian population to decide, and we should let them do so and find the ways of let them express what they want to do. And so by saying that, it is also about understanding what is going on in both civil society of Israel and of the Palestinian territories, and being more sensitive, to what is happening on the ground with those countries. That's the first one. The second one is to connect with the 2 sides of the issue, and to be listening a little bit more to what they're saying, and listening a little bit more to what we can do to help. The long tradition of the EU has been to trying to impose our own thinking about all of this. And I think this is over, and we have to change that. If only because, once again, as I was stating earlier, I'm not sure we entirely understand what is going on in both societies, and that we need to be closer to the ground and to what the people think, and take it on board, and adapt our proposition, our assistance, our cooperation to what people think on the ground. That doesn't mean that we have to give up our principles once again, but it's about how to adapt it to a new political and social reality that is existing on the ground. And also, let me add, I alluded to that in an earlier conversation, maybe get rid of some of the mistakes we have made in the past. Learn a little bit more about lessons learned from the past. Today, we're still stuck with this attitude we have taken with Hamas around 2006, which was, by the way, in total contradiction with our whole statement about free and fair elections. This was the outcome of an election, and we should have taken that into account at the time. But having been there in the political circles around powers in Paris or in Brussels, I can tell you that this was a very emotional reaction, and nobody could convince anyone of changing that attitude. We're nearly 20 years later. We should adapt our position to these new reality. And if we are looking now again for Palestinian election, as many of us think that should be one way forward, we need to take into account the lessons learned from the past. So the third idea, in my opinion, is also to discuss with all the players on the ground. That means naturally the Americans, because they are having a large responsibility as we are witnessing their ongoing efforts to normalize the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And this is the game in town at the moment, and we have to take that into account. But it's also discussing with the Saudis, and we're doing that, Jordan, the Gulf, the other Gulf countries, Iran, and other players that want to play their part in the region, China, India, and others. For the EU, this is important because we always tend to be very much EU-centric. And the reality, let's be honest, is that we're not anymore a major player in that part of the world. We are one player among many others, and we have to take that into account. But, and that's the last point I wanted to underline, we have leverage. We have leverage in this region. We have already played a major role in our financial assistance and our cooperation and our technical assistance with the Palestinian Authority. We have leverage with Israel. I was part of those difficult negotiation at some point with Israel with regard to the Horizon, renewing the Horizon 2020 cooperation. That was the way it was called at the time. Scientific cooperation, research cooperation. And it was very obvious that for the Israeli side, this was very important to be part of that program. Which give us some leverage and allow us to make our point that you would particularly appreciate, Hugh, as you quite often emphasize the whole issue of differentiation, and that was really what was at the heart of our discussion. So it's about taking also that kind of profile. In other words, being smart and agile, and accepting the fact that we're one player among many others, but that we have something to say, and that we have something to put on the table in the economic field, maybe in the political field also. And this is what we need to do. Stick to a clear direction that we would impose to ourselves and move ahead. People will tell me, and I will end on that note, Hugh, people will tell me, but we're completely divided today. And it's true that in the last 10 or 15 years, because of many events unfolding, because of what has happened in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords and with the Trump administration and its decision with on Jerusalem, that this has put the unity of the European Union under strain. I think we have to recognize that. But I'm personally of the opinion that precisely if we can find again a clear strategic vision that is put forward by EU institution, and among others by the High Representative and his team, and that you force member states to discuss that kind of strategic vision and those strategic guidelines, then you will see that maybe we will be more numerous than we think in going ahead. And for those who disagree, well, why not let them go on their own and stick to those who are ready to go on? We have enough flexibility in our institutions to do that if we want to. And I think this should be the way forward.
Thank you very much, not just for some optimism, but also for that rallying call for the EU to re-engage, but also more importantly, to be able to develop a new strategic vision to guide its efforts going forward. And I hope these points will also percolate in the last session of our conference, session number 4, which will look at alternative strategies to Oslo with a really great panel. And I'm also delighted that it will be in the expert hands of Sasha Polakau-Soransky, who's the deputy editor at Foreign Policy and has had many other hats before that with the New York Times, and is also the author of a book, which I'd recommend, So let me hand over to you now, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Hugh, and everyone in Washington and here. So this panel is about alternatives to Oslo. And to go back to something mentioned on the last panel by Ian Lustig, the idea that the international community has been on a carousel and it's going round and round and not taking us anywhere. And I'd like to start with that to just bring this discussion away from the usual paradigm to some extent. And I'm going to put out a few questions, and then the panelists will give their initial remarks, and then hopefully we can get into a bit of a debate before getting to the audience. So if Oslo has failed, what actually comes next? And I think we have a variety of views on what a successful peace process would look like, or perhaps there won't be a peace process at all, as some of the panelists on the last panel mentioned. And if there's a new reality emerging in another way, peacefully or violently, without formal negotiations, what would that look like? What would the politics around that look like? And some of the questions that inevitably arise when we have this discussion is the two-state solution really dead? Is that a good thing if it is? Should it be abandoned entirely? And is binationalism a viable solution? Dana mentioned on the last panel some of the lessons we should learn from other geographic locations like Bosnia, what not to do. And in any of these scenarios, how will Palestinian rights be secured? How will accountability for Israeli violations of those rights be secured? And who ultimately is going to be at the table if there is another round of negotiations? And I think Aziz will talk at some stage about the potentially impending Saudi-Israeli deal and what that might mean. Would that assist this process? Would it obstruct this process? Would it center Palestinian rights or ignore them? And is there a way that regional normalization could actually help secure Palestinian rights? So those are just some of the questions I'd like to put out there. Now I'll just briefly introduce the panelists and then we can get started. The longer bios are in the program, but we have Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch, Martin Indek, the former US ambassador to Israel and special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, Aziz Al-Ghashian from the Richardson Institute, and Claire Hajjaj from Intermediate. So let me start with Omar in Washington, if you'd like to give an introductory statement, please.
Great. Thank you all. And let me echo my thanks to Khalid, to Hugh, to Faria, to everyone who's involved in putting together this really rich day and a half of discussions. One of the benefits of being the last panel is that you have the chance to kind of pull at some of the threads that have been raised over the last day and a half. And I really, in my introductory remarks, want to make sort of three primary points, which I'll go through one by one and look forward to engaging further in the discussion. The first point I really want to make is that any alternative to Oslo must be rooted in the recognition of the reality on the ground. For far too long, the discourse in Washington, in Brussels, has been disconnected from the reality on the ground that those of us in human rights organizations document day in and day out. It should go without saying that the first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly. The wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong step of remedies or actions to be taken. So let's start with some basic realities. A 56-year occupation is not temporary. Denying millions of people their fundamental rights solely based on who they are, solely because they're Palestinian, is not simply a matter of an abusive occupation. A 30-plus year peace process will not, on its own, dismantle systematic repression. I think it's worth noting on this occasion that the peace process has gone on for more than half the length of the occupation, a half-century-long occupation. Take a minute to think about that passage of time. Democracy, as my friend Hagai Al-Ad, until recently the executive director of the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, put it, democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. A daily reality of structural violence and repression is not a conflict. a single system methodically engineered to ensure the domination by one people over another is not a conflict between two equal parties. Apartheid is not some hypothetical future scenario. It might not even have been one when Yitzhak Rabin warned about it in the 1970s, or when John Kerry warned about it in 2014, or when Jimmy Carter warned about it in 2006. As was mentioned in the previous panel, it's no longer 2 minutes to midnight, guys. It's probably 5 or 6 a.m. The threshold has been crossed. Apartheid is the lived reality for millions of Palestinians. Now, this isn't just some conclusion that's been reached by Human Rights Watch. I can tell you today, it is the consensus position in the global human rights movement. Now, let us be very clear. Palestinians have been telling us for years, for decades, that apartheid is part of their lived reality, and not enough of us listened. Not enough of us in these kinds of conversations centered their voices. But what we've seen in the last several years is prominent international and Israeli human rights organizations independently reach that same conclusion. They did so, and again, apartheid is a legal term, as Francesca pointed out yesterday, derived from major instruments of international law. They did it by documenting the facts, applying the law, and the overwhelming evidence made clear that the reality Palestinians face is one of apartheid. But it's not just human rights organizations that have reached this conclusion. I want to note legal scholars have done the same, including Lawrence Tribe, including the Harvard Law School International Human Rights Clinic, including major UN mechanisms, not just the Special Rapporteur for the OPT, but other mechanisms, UN investigative committees, prominent commentators, including here in the US at places like MSNBC. We have beyond that former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, 400 plus European members of the European Parliament and European parliamentarians, former European foreign ministers, French foreign minister, Luxembourg. In Israel, we have the former Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, Netanyahu appointed director of the Mossad, former commanders in the Israeli army, the former Director General of Israel. I could go on for another 20 minutes. But beyond just individuals, today we have a reality where states have reached that position of apartheid. South Africa, Namibia, the African Union, the Organization of Islamic Conference, the Arab League, Indonesia. In the recent submission to the ICJ, 54 states and 3 interstate organizations made submissions, 24 raised apartheid. So just take a moment to understand the consensus that is developing. We are in a very unique moment where all of the experts, in essence, that look at this question, all have reached the determination that the reality is apartheid, and there hasn't been a substantive rebuttal. Why is this so important? It's so important because it is incumbent upon all of us in any solution to take cognizance of that reality. There will be more voices coming in the days and weeks ahead. So for each of you, I hope you leave this by going back to your boards, to your organizations, to your staff. If you're not using the word apartheid, ask yourself, what are you waiting for? If the Mossad director is saying it, certainly you can overcome concerns with your boards or statements. It is the reality, and we cannot move forward. The ship is sailing, and history will not look kindly if you have not reached that conclusion. The second point I want to make is that we must, and this has been echoed by so many others, but I want to reiterate it, we must move beyond a singular focus on a conflict and negotiations and peace paradigm, and we must apply the same sets of human rights-based recommendations that we do in other situations of structural repression, of crimes against humanity in Israel, Palestine, that we do in other parts of the world. For us at Human Rights Watch, it's very clear. We found apartheid in the treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar. We found crimes against humanity and persecution in China's treatment of the Uyghurs. I myself documented likely crimes against humanity in Egypt's killings of protesters. The playbook is very well established. They include 3 fundamental things. One is recognition of that reality, as I noted. And I should say in this particular context, that means states making statements about apartheid. That means states supporting the International Court of Justice, UN mechanisms, the Commission of Inquiry that are looking into these issues, and they reactivate the mechanisms that exist at the UN, at the Apartheid Convention to take on apartheid. But secondly, this means support for measures of accountability, which includes not only the ICC investigation, and we'll get into that more in a second, but also includes universal jurisdiction prosecution and use of targeted sanctions, and travel bans against those implicated. And finally, it means ending all forms of complicity in the crime, suspending arms sales so long as apartheid continues, vetting all agreements with Israel to ensure non-complicity, reviewing business engagement. The playbook is very, very well known. So that brings me to my final point, right? Which is, how do we get there, right? If we all sort of know, I don't really want to dwell much on what I'm not saying the human rights mechanisms are, so we can talk about, what was mentioned in the last panel, but we know that wherever we want to get in the future, we're not going to get anywhere if we're not diagnosing reality and applying the kinds of tools at a situation of this gravity. So what are pathways to get there? And that's really where I want to end my remarks. And I'll just say three things, under which will be a couple of subpoints, but three major things. One is a message for civil society. One is a message for advocacy in general, and one is for those of us in Washington and Brussels. So starting with civil society, I think we really, and I said this to some of you yesterday, I think we have a really unique moment today, because on one hand, we're facing unprecedented challenges. Let's not forget that the situation on the ground is in many ways unprecedentedly bad. More Palestinians in administrative detention today without trial or charge than at any time in 3 decades. More Palestinians in the West Bank killed in 2023 than in any year since the UN began documenting killings. The Gaza situation in Gaza, with the closure and humanitarian situation, continues to deteriorate by the day. We all know what this new Israeli government is. But at the same time, we have this moment of unprecedented opportunity because of the paradigm shift, because of the mainstreaming and consensus around the apartheid analysis, because there are, and we can be skeptical, but we have for the first time an International Court of Justice advisory opinion. It's the second one ever, the first one with a broader mandate, not just on the separation barrier, but broadly at the legal consequences of Israel's occupation. We have, over the last 2.5 years, for the first time, a formal probe at the International Criminal Court. We have, at the first time ever, a commission of inquiry at the UN with a standing mandate, with a mandate to look at both sides of the green line. We need a civil society to better coordinate, to seize the opportunities, and to confront the challenges that we face. My message for global advocacy is we need to put much more of a focus on the global South. As I noted, there are more and more states that are willing to stick their neck out, as I noted, noting the reality of apartheid, calling for actions. Yes, there are counter trends. I'm not saying it's the only narrative, but we have a moment where more states and more bodies are willing to take action. We must focus our advocacy not only on Brussels and Washington, I'll get to in a minute, but really working in conjunction with that, because the more voices that come out there, the more the consensus that exists, the further we'll come. And it goes back to the point about the peace process. The problem with the peace process narrative, right, is it treats human rights abuse as a symptom of the problem, not the core issue. And I think having global South states lead on a UN and otherwise approach that's focused on actions is critical. But I'm not saying we give up in Washington or Brussels. So really the last thing I want to say is, what are some we need to think about strategic openings that allow us to move towards recognition. And I'm going to give a few possible suggestions. And again, we can expand on this in the Q&A. Okay, we know the US and countries in Europe aren't going to maybe say apartheid today. Hopefully an ICJ, other things move and get them there. But there are statements about a one-state reality of unequal rights, of perpetual occupation. There's a history of those. Let's push for more of those statements. Don't repeat empty platitudes about solutions or et cetera. Focus on what's a more accurate characterization. Secondly, we must keep the number one focus on safeguarding the space to do human rights advocacy. So our number one ask in every meeting in Washington or Brussels should be to ensure that the 6 or 7 Palestinian organizations that are currently outlawed by the Israeli government are allowed to continue doing the work. We need to call on states to say that publicly, to meet with the organizations, but also we need to push back against the misuse of allegations of anti-Semitism, the effort to incorporate the IHRA definition, which has been used as a tool to muzzle advocacy for Palestinian rights. That's the second thing. Third example I want to say is about the ICC and ICJ, which is to say we have a moment with what's happening in Ukraine, right, where there's discussion of the need to safeguard the rules-based international order. And there's even momentum around support for these mechanisms. Let's link that directly and explicitly to support for these institutions. I'm going to wrap up in 1 minute. The last 3 things I want to say is sanctions, targeted sanctions. We have a moment with the Israeli protest movement where there's opening and receptivity to talking about this, at least with respect to ministers in the current Israeli government. Let's go through that opening. Secondly, conditioning of aid. right? There is, again, some momentum, some activism. We should go there. And finally, for the US context, right, there are things like links to US citizens, whether it's Term Mas'iyya and settlers, whether it's Shireen Abu Akleh, whether it's the visa program. Let's go there. Bottom line, recognize reality, human rights-based measures, and strategic opportunities in Brussels and Washington, and focus on the global south. I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Omar. I'd like to go to Martin now, please. Martin, you're muted still.
A rookie mistake that doesn't seem to change no matter how many times I do. Excuse me. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Khaled, for inviting me to participate in this panel. Not surprisingly, my approach is, and my task today is rather different from Omar's, where the focus is more on diplomacy than on human rights. And I was asked to address the question of whether an outside-in approach to the effort to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might have some greater saliency than the doomed efforts of before. Let me just say that the logic of an outside-in approach is fairly clear. It is that the Arab states who have not yet made peace with Israel, normalized their relations with Israel, could use the leverage of such an offer of peace to entice the Israelis to make concessions to the Palestinians in a way that would give greater gain both for Israelis and Palestinians, and therefore move the sides towards a resolution of the conflict. The specific ways in which the Arab states could do this would be, on the one side, to give Israelis the sense that they're not just making peace with the Palestinians, they're making peace with the whole Arab world. Kind of like a hamburger helper, if you like. And on the Palestinian side, to provide an anchor or anchors for the Palestinian state in the making, to support it and assist it in fulfilling the obligations that would come with a resolution of the conflict. Obligations on both sides, but obligations that the Palestinians have had difficulty fulfilling insofar as they've had to make them because they lack the institutions of statehood. And so that's the basic idea behind an outside-in approach. To state the obvious, the result, as in so many other diplomatic activities focused on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the results are disappointing, to say the least. Part of the reason lies in the fact that the Palestinians thought that it would be more effective in terms of using the leverage of Arab state involvement to withhold that, in effect, to hold it out as a carrot that would be delivered once Israel agreed to establish an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. And that withholding of the normalization was something that, as a form of pressure on Israel, was singularly unsuccessful in persuading Israelis that it would be worthwhile to make meaningful concessions to the Palestinians, particularly when it comes to territory, in order to achieve peace with the Arab states. The second problem was that the Arab states were unwilling to play the role assigned to them by the Palestinians in this regard. The most obvious example of that is the Abraham Accords, where the Emiratis, Bahrainis, Moroccans went ahead with only one requirement when it came to the Palestinians, and that was the Emirati promise secured for 3.5 years of no annexation, or at least no formal annexation by the Israeli government. But beyond that, there was nothing, particularly Bahrain and Morocco did not condition their normalization on anything for the Palestinians. But it goes back beyond the Abraham Accords, well back to the very beginning of the peace process, with the Egyptians deciding to make their peace with Israel without conditioning it on meaningful advances to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People may recall back in the days of Camp David I, that all that was agreed in those days was that there would be an autonomy negotiation, not statehood, but self-rule for the Palestinians, an autonomy negotiation which predictably went nowhere. But the Israeli-Egyptian peace deal went ahead, notwithstanding the opposition in the rest of the Arab world. And so it has continued. No Arab state has been prepared in the end to condition its relationship with Israel on meaningful progress towards Palestinian statehood. So that really puts a very serious question mark over the idea of an outside-in approach until now. Because now we have the chance to test the proposition again. I'm referring, of course, to the fact that Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has now made clear, quite publicly, that he is ready, willing, and keen to have normalization with Israel. And of course, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reciprocates that feeling. So we now have, in these days, a real sense of momentum behind the idea of an Israeli-Saudi peace deal for full normalization of relations. And so the question comes again, what's in it for the Palestinians? Is there a willingness on the part of Saudi Arabia and on the part of the United States, which is the midwife of this deal, without which this deal cannot go ahead because the Saudis are demanding a whole lot of things from the United States, quite expensive, difficult things, in order to do the normalization with Israel. So the United States not only is the midwife of this deal, but has considerable leverage for its requirements. And so the question then comes down to those two things. Will the Saudis demand something significant for the Palestinians? And will the United States insist on it as part of the deal? As far as the Saudis are concerned, we don't have a great deal of clarity. In MBS's statement this week, he talked about easing the life of the Palestinians. Well, that sounds like a throwback to Secretary of State George Shultz's quality of life for Palestinians, which was noticeably short of anything designed to achieve statehood for the Palestinians. Of course, you have the Saudi foreign minister who says there has to be statehood for the Palestinians to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But if one parses his words carefully, one can see that this is not a condition for full normalization, Saudi Arabia. And I think that it's just like in the case of every other Arab state, Saudi Arabia is not going to hold up its deal for the sake of the Palestinian national cause. So it comes down to what the United States will do or should do. Here, I think that there's more reason to be hopeful, partly because the United States has to make such big payments in terms of a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, in terms of nuclear enrichment capability for Saudi Arabia, that it gives President Biden the opportunity to turn to Netanyahu, as I believe he has now done, and to say to him, you too have to pay up for this deal. And the price is in Palestinian coin, that something significant needs to be done on the Palestinian front to bring this deal to fruition. And Biden has a number of reasons for wanting this, and I think for sticking to it. The first is the simple reality that if the Palestinians are sidelined yet again by this Saudi deal, that this will add to the despair, the explosiveness of the situation, already a tinderbox in the West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza, as we've seen in recent days. And if the whole thing blows up, then the United States will be left holding the bag, having made commitments to the Saudis, having committed to a defense treaty, and to have the whole thing simply disappear because of the failure to address the Palestinian question. Secondly, the United States, or President Biden, needs to get 67 votes in the Senate to get the defense treaty for Saudi Arabia, without which there's no peace deal. And the Democrats in the Senate are going to want to see something significant for the Palestinians if they're going to hold their nose and vote for a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, with a crown prince who is, let's say, not exactly the flavor of the month in Washington. But the third thing relates to the relationship between the United States and Israel. The far right-wing Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu is hell-bent on de facto and eventually de jure annexation of the West Bank, pursued by the far-right ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Their plan is very clear, and if it is not stopped, or put in differently, if it is given a turbo boost by an Israeli-Saudi peace deal, which does not stop their plans for de facto and de jure annexation of the West Bank, then the whole notion of an American commitment to a two-state solution goes completely out the window. And therefore, for all three reasons, I think President Biden needs to insist upon a series of steps that will, in the first instance, stop the annexation, stop the expansion of settlements, stop the legalization of illegal outposts, hand over territory from Israeli control to Palestinian control in the West Bank, and lay the foundations for the opening of a route with Saudi involvement to an eventual negotiation that could lead to a two-state solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Let's go to Aziz, who I know has plenty to say on this issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for joining. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for the organizers for inviting me. I just wanted to say a few words, perhaps, about the nature of, I would say, the Saudi foreign policy towards Israel. And I think, as Ambassador Endick alluded to, a lot of it is not very clear about what they would want from, for example, the Palestinians or for the Palestinians. And I think that is accurate because this is the nature of the relationship, that it is deliberately ambiguous constantly. And this is actually historically. So when looking at, in my research on Saudi foreign policy towards Israel, I began to realize that I'm actually studying a lot of Saudi foreign policy towards the US, and then Israel is actually a part of that. So it's not exactly Saudi-Israeli relations, and particular Saudi policy towards Israel is not a bilateral relationship, and it's not close to or almost a trilateral relationship. It's something in between this kind of very vague position, which I think suits sometimes, which Saudi, I think, operate very well in. Now, why is this important to say the nature of this relationship or the nature of the Saudi policy towards Israel? Is because I think we could see this now, and I hope it explains and sheds light on the Saudi position right now with the current situation and the potential normalization deal. I think the Saudis have been very good historically at throwing the ball back in the other people's court, and especially with this peace process. A lot of the times, I think they've been very consistent with saying, well, you know, we're ready to normalize relations when this happens. We're ready to normalize relations once this happens. A lot of this, you know, a lot of what this is a Palestinian state. This is what was said, but I think, you know, if I was to say to you, for example, let me quote or paraphrase a Saudi official saying this, that, you know, if the concessions are acceptable, and then others will find it acceptable, other players, then I think we could have peace with Israel. Now, if I was to say this was a Saudi official that said this now, the headlines will go crazy and say, oh my goodness, isn't this amazing? And isn't this, you know, at least a year ago or so. But in fact, that this was King Faisal all the way back in 1969. Saying this very position. So we're not seeing a fundamentally different position. We perhaps see fundamentally different expectations now, but the position in itself is very fluid, constantly. That's just part of the very fabric and the DNA of this relationship towards Israel. Now, again, so this goes back really to, you know, what is it, what, you know, again, it's conditioned on what Saudi will get from the United States, and if the concessions are enough to legitimize this relationship from the Palestinians, or if the negotiations or the concessions for the Palestinians are enough to become a foundation of legitimization to this relationship, then we could see normalization very quickly. But just the one point on the demands and the difficulty of the demands, in my opinion, I think the Saudi-Israeli relationship is not a very linear relationship. It's anything but linear. And that's what makes it very difficult to really pin down. You know, it takes sometimes a few steps forward and then it stops. It takes a little step back. It takes a little step to the side. All of a sudden there's a sprint towards Israel and then it stops. It teases a little bit. Hey, I mean, if you want some of this, then you're going to have to do 1, 2, and 3. You know, it's a very, very elusive relationship. And I think right now, these demands that Saudi has made from the United States also says a lot about its vision or its perception towards Israel, is that I think Saudi does see strategic utility in Israel. I think it's particularly, it does see it in aspect of the economy and tech. But in my humble opinion, I don't think it sees enough strategic utility in Israel to warrant this relationship with Israel that will forego significant Palestinian concessions. And as a result, we see this demands from the United States. And that's part of the whole Saudi balancing act of not being too close, but not being too far constantly. But I think, you know, what we're seeing now is also the Saudi preparing for potential normalization. And I think the conditioning has already begun right now. And I think with the MBS Fox News interview, I think to me, it suggests that it was a sign to the Arab, the population and the world is, you know, stand by, there might be something. So now I think, what can we get from this? What can be a good opportunity, a good Palestinian component that perhaps this relationship can be leveraged towards or obtain? I think there's two things. Firstly, and I think as many people have spoken about and alluded to, especially Ambassador Indyk, about stopping annexation, stopping the expansion of settlements. This is an element of preservation. We're trying to preserve the two-state solution. We're trying to preserve that. And I think the second element that I think has been overlooked, which I think also Ambassador Indyk alluded to, which in my opinion, a facilitatory element of something that, okay, well, if there is something that preserves, because if there needs to be something that becomes a continuous process, and a continuous process that hopefully attaches to the regional momentum that has taken place, the regional economic momentum that has taken place. Now, I think the first speaker alluded to something very interesting, which is, let's call a spade. And I think if I could say that about the Abraham Accords, I would call it the Abraham Business Accords, not necessarily the Abraham Peace Accords. And I think what was missing in those accords was that perhaps, a lot of the times it was all for the Palestinians, this was for the Palestinians, this was for, this is really, the discourse that was coming out of the UAE was really not about the suspension of annexation. It was actually the elimination of annexation. That's how it was branded. But now we heard it, and we heard it from the ambassador of the UAE not too long ago, is that, well, we have no leverage to this. So I think what was missing in that Abraham Accords as a regional framework was the channels that could, and the mechanisms that could channel the wealth that was generated, and this out-in approach to facilitate something of a change of a paradigm or something on the Palestinian issue that will improve the lives of Palestinians, but also really give an economic horizon, a humanitarian horizon, and a horizon of improvement of just general well-being, hopefully, that will then lead to a political solution. I think, for me, I stayed most of my research career, all of it actually, just looking at Saudi foreign policy towards Israel. And so I'm very limited on other things around the peace process. But I think I remember reading a lot about the peace process and just wondering, and I wonder if Ambassador Indyk could speak to this, but looking at the paradigm of negotiations, and particularly the Clinton, Barak and Arafat Accords, or the summit in Camp David, and look at that as this dynamic. And this was mentioned yesterday with Dan Kurtzer and others, that the negotiation, it was just too asymmetric. And when I'm reading this, I just wonder what would have happened if the Arab League was there. What would have happened if the Arab League was present to compensate for that asymmetry? And not only compensate to defend, but compensate for that asymmetry in a manner of incentives. And just to say, listen, well, it's not just between you two, you could get something there. And I think this is where the Arab League could have done more historically and try to be, rather than have normalization or a peace deal with the Palestinians first and then into the Arab world, I think maybe it could have been closer together. Of course, this is the benefit of hindsight, so it's very easy for me to sit here in Brussels and talk about this. But I think now we see this kind of paradigm materializing, maybe not in the sequence that we hoped it would be, or ideally it would be, but I think there should be a great deal of investment. Exactly, the individual here supports me. But I think there should be a great deal of investment in trying to think about a process of continuation of this Palestinian element and tie this Palestinian element to the regional economic trajectory and link it to Palestinian projects that will make it grow together. It sounds very ideal, but I think we don't have enough other options other than to be ideal. Unless, I mean, I ain't gonna lie, I was very depressed after the last panel. You know what I'm saying? But, you know, why not be tried ideal? I think that's where I really want to at least focus on and dedicate myself to, is that let's see if we could get something very well out of this. And all we need to do is connect the dots. A lot easier said than done. Connect the bridges. There's been failures, by the way, in public diplomacy. There's been failures, you know, on how we really don't, you know, the Abraham Accords allowed each other to Gulf, people from the Gulf and Israel, and in particular to co-op, to look at, you know, to mingle, to talk with each other. And when I do talk, it's amazing how we just don't know much about each other, yet we live very close with each other. So there is a massive gap. And I think if it's a gap in understanding, there's certainly going to be a gap in the mechanisms of generating wealth and hopefully providing a solution. I'll stop there. I'll shut up, and I'll pass it over.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Hey, so last speaker. Luckily, I have the answer right here. 5-point plan. I'm saying everyone can come up with a 5-point plan. Yeah, I mean, it's been, I think probably alternative strategies to Oslo is perhaps the most terrifying title of any panel anywhere, because well, I think we all feel that this is a moment. I think we all feel the responsibility of this moment, and all the speakers over the last couple of days have expressed the same thing, sort of fundamentally, that there are 3 different realities, and you've got the Palestinian people's reality, which is kind of being a double prisoner of first Israel and then their own broken politics. Then there's Israeli society's reality, a country that is, you know, becoming less and less liberal, more and more autocratic, you know, killing and drowning out any of those voices that once used to exist, that actually did see that it was fundamental, existential, to satisfy the identity demand of the people that they had displaced, now that those voices don't happen. And then there is this sort of bizarre alternate reality, which is the international diplomatic reality. And in the international diplomatic reality, the kind of conversations you keep having are about ever more elaborate processes and different processes. And it's almost like, I don't know how many of you have read Great Expectations, but do you remember Miss Havisham, who sat in her wedding dress for 40 years or something like that, waiting for and it was a little bit like that. I mean, in hindsight, we can look back and we can say, Oslo, which was a moment of hope. And for me as a child at the time, it was a moment of hope. And I will always remember it as that. And there are still things about it that were fundamental. It was a moment where the Palestinians were able to get the Israelis to say, yes, there needs to be a satisfaction of your national aspirations in one way or another. But in hindsight, you can look back and say, look, forcing the Palestinians to be both poacher and gamekeeper for 30 years. I remember when we were looking at the 25th anniversary of Oslo, and I was working with a Palestinian friend, and we were trying very hard to pitch a documentary to some very uninterested TV channels, and we were trying to find a sexy name for it. And I was like, oh, Oslo, the triumph and the tragedy. And he said, what about Oslo, the zombie apocalypse? It's just like that works as well. Because it sucked life and legitimacy eventually out of the idea of Palestinian resistance. And it created this sort of weird world where on the one hand, you have a fundamental disconnect between people and politics, but also the armed groups no longer served the sort of same political ends as the political sort of the leadership. It was a really strange way of looking at a conflict. So, you know, what you have now is a delegitimized politics and an armed resistance that in the last, well, I'd say at the moment, is almost doing more to help the Israeli narrative than to hurt it. Normally in political crises, in political conflicts, and your armed resistance like Sinn Féin and the IRA are the ones that create a mutually hurting stalemate. And the mutually hurting stalemate, as classical people will tell you, is what you need to be in a position to be able to solve a conflict. But a mutually hurting stalemate is pretty bad. So when it's pretty difficult to achieve, when Israel has become progressively over time better and better at containing this and using the West Bank actually as a kind of, let's say, laboratory for experimentation with all of its surveillance equipment, for its military equipment, the stuff that it ended up being able to export all over the Middle East was trialed there. And they were able to do it. So, and it also allows this alternate reality where we think, on the one hand, you have people who think there's going to be an explosion in Palestine, and that explosion is going to reignite demand for peace, and there's going to be a collapse of the current order and something new is going to emerge. That's one school of thought. Another school of thought, a little bit like the outside-in narrative, is that you can make peace around the Palestinians, that resistance doesn't really matter, the Palestinians don't really matter. You can just come up with a framework that gives the Palestinians, as MBS so eloquently said in his speech recently, something, and that something will be okay. It will be enough. Maybe I don't know, maybe one of those two things will happen. I think it's extremely, extremely unlikely. But if you are thinking about what does another process look like, and I feel like we're a long way from another process, but I also respect what Darnell Kurd said, is that there are people who don't want to wait anymore, and they don't want to wait for long-term fundamental reform in Palestinian politics. They don't want to wait for a new generation of Israelis 30 years down the line. So it is incumbent on us to think about what is something then, if it's not the something that MBS has in mind, which is something that is economic. And I totally fundamentally agree that economics is going to have a role to play, but all conflicts that have eventually come to a place where there has been peace, where some fundamental demand has been satisfied, they've had to have an identity component to the solution. It can't just be about making people's lives better. In Northern Ireland, the Catholics in Northern Ireland wanted to be Irish. They did not want to be British. So there was not possible to find any kind of solution that did not satisfy that demand in some way, irrespective of whatever is happening with Brexit and what may eventually happen with a referendum there. So you are going to need several different components. You are going to need a regional component. We talk about one state, two state solutions. The whole region is a one state, actually. It's so interconnected across these very, very porous and fragile borders that if you think that just adding an extra line somewhere, I don't know, around Jerusalem is going to somehow create a new answer, it's clearly not. So it's all a one state process in a funny kind of way. So in the end, what is it you could look at? And there are some things. I think the first thing is we have to find a way to diplomatically to kill the zombie. We have to find an off-ramp for the international community. We talk about, there's been a lot of talk about pressure on Israel. Better and more eloquent people than me can talk about that. I'm thinking about, again, in conflicts, generally speaking, you need an off-ramp as well as pressure. So not on Israel, I'm talking about the off-ramp for the international community that's been wedded to this corpse bride, which is the Oslo process for the last 30 years. How do you find a way for them to step down and say, okay, we don't go for one state or two state or de facto one state, but what we accept is there is not a legitimate process, and that these structures are not delivering, and that there are terrifying protection violations that are a huge concern to us internationally. And we now agree that we're going to work with parties to figure out what is now the step, what's the next step. And then it needs to be an off-ramp that includes not just Europe, although I think Europe would be a good place for that to start, but reaches out also to China and India. Because China and India do not have a great track record, by the way, of negotiating peace based on identity and human rights concerns anywhere in the world. Just go to Kashmir or the Uyghurs or anywhere, but they are players in this field. So if there can be an international diplomatic off-ramp that would create, I think, a new sense of urgency to come up with new avenues for the international community to engage. And that's the kind of thing that can be done with a handful of concerned people in each of these capitals coming together and creating a platform. So that's something to think about, I think. I think you need to end, and very quickly, the policy of no engagement. And that is an easy, easy win. It's an easy win. And that's something that could be done tomorrow. We are now talking to people about, you have had 20 years of prescribing Islamist armed groups. And that has clearly delivered you a fundamentally wonderful success against the operations of those groups all over the world. Ended recruitment, we have peace in our time. If it hasn't, is there not a better strategy? Would it not be smarter, wiser, and more strategic to step into this space that otherwise other people are going to step into and do the talking? It's not like nobody's talking to them. So it's not just Hamas. It's the idea that these groups are going to melt away if somehow Abu Mazen comes back from Riyadh with something in his hand is utterly nonsensical. Somebody needs to be talking to these groups, and it cannot be transactional conversations about ceasefires and borders and arms. It has to be a political dialogue, and that is very easy. Just to say that in 1973, the Irish and the British agreed the Sunningdale Agreement, and 25 years later, they came up with exactly the same agreements, pretty much, the Good Friday Agreement, the difference being that the IRA was involved. And one of the Irish politicians at the time stood up and he said, this is basically Sunningdale for slow learners. It's fundamental. You need to be actually talking to the people that you're fighting with at the end of the day. The next thing I think is the sort of, I know I use this term and it's probably not the right term, but I guess a sort of identity intifada. You have resistance that has been disconnected from a political process. You also have a hugely credible resistance amongst civil society, voices that are being squashed by the PA because no criticism is allowed of the PA anywhere inside the Palestinian territories. You need to build and knit together an idea of what a Palestinian demand could be. Somebody very rightly said, we don't know. It's not for us to say if it should be one state or two state or 5 states or whatever, but unless you can articulate a demand that has legitimacy, it's extremely hard to know who you want to be as a people. And the rage is so profound at the moment that no wonder we can't find answers. It's not fair to talk about processes when the voices that could create legitimate demands are simply not able to articulate those demands. So I think that there should be a process, and again, many people have great ideas about what that should look like. And it needs to involve the diaspora. We've talked about changing dynamics in the democratic supporters in the US. There has been a profound shift away from support to Israel, unquestioning support to Israel, and a new concern to try and find solutions, understanding what the Palestinian conflict has actually done to Israel, which is fundamentally destroy it. So we can capitalize on that. There need to be new mechanisms to connect those diasporas that want to be part of articulating what the demand should be of both peoples. And I know that that is not great for some people, but for me, maybe because of where I come from, whatever, but I think it's really fundamental and important. And the last thing is legitimacy at the table. Now, there are many, many different versions of negotiating delegations. People have said in past processes, you know, if we could imagine today, if Oslo were to happen tomorrow, then you would not have, can you imagine a sort of Abu Mazen coming and this being the kind of thing that could deliver an Oslo? It could not. We know that if you are going to actually, even for very, very popular leaders, negotiating peace agreements like Santos with the FARC, you lose your popularity in negotiating those agreements, and Santos lost the referendum. The referendum in Northern Ireland only just scraped through in Colombia, and he lost his referendum in Colombia. So you need to have people at the table who can carry and deliver. It is the difference between reaching a peace and delivering a peace. Reaching some kind of satisfaction of those identity demands and being able to actually deliver and implement them in a way that ends violence and makes people able to then move forward and create their own aspirations. You can't do it unless you have a different negotiating delegation, and that needs to represent Palestinian society in a different way. So to talk to the PA about what that is going to look like is hard, but it absolutely needs to be done. What is going to be the peace platform that the Palestinians take forward? Doesn't mean you need to suddenly fundamentally revamp the entire leadership, although I'm all for a new pluralistic and government. But I think that's a conversation that could be had. And I don't know, I guess the end thing would just be, people have talked about possibility and depression, and it is very depressing coming to these meetings because you can very quickly become an expert in all the reasons why nothing can ever work and nothing can ever change. And then you imagine what it must be like to be a Palestinian or, you know, heaven help you, an Israeli that actually wants to see a different solution for their country and the Palestinians. And you stop feeling so sorry for yourself. So we need to believe that it is possible. It is possible. You can go and stand in Berlin and look at the wall and remember the last people to get shot trying to cross it was 1989. and you can go to Northern Ireland, you can go to many places. It is possible. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, because there are no perfect countries and there's no perfect peace, but we can do better than this, fundamentally. And if we do not believe, those people who care about it, that we can do better than this, we will never do better than this. So keeping that sense of possibility alive is very, very important. And I think that's the challenge of the next few years.
Thank you, Claire. So I want to do a lightning round of questions to each of you, and I really mean lightning round, 2-minute responses max, and then we're going to go to the audience. So let's go back in order to Omar. You talked a lot about narrative and the importance of narrative, importance of naming things for what they are. And I'm just curious, how much does that really change the reality on the ground? How much can the right terminology and the right narrative to frame the way a conflict or a peace process is talked about, how much will that actually affect the reality on the ground for Palestinians?
So for me, I mean, as noted, I think, and I'll give an anecdote. Maybe it's the best way to tell the story. I remember being in a European capital advocating for stronger action against PA, arbitrary arrest and torture of critics, of dissidents. And the response that I got from that official, I said, issue a public statement, cut funding to abusive security forces, was, but Omar, we need the PA for the peace process. So the peace process became not only a shield for Israel, but even for the PA when you're talking about human rights-based asks. And I think, to me, a huge part of that is that, the zombie framework, as Claire noted, is rooted in this fiction of a peace process that presumes that human rights abuses are symptoms. So if you treat the root cause, there's no dialogue. It's the solution without a problem. You forget about the problem that necessitates a solution. And meanwhile, each day, Palestinians continue to live a reality of oppression. So for me, shifting the paradigm is critical, because if the framework is apartheid, or is it, even if the question is apartheid, as opposed to, well, this is a conflict and there's security and occupation, automatically you start thinking differently about how you dismantle systematic repression as opposed to a lack of a peace process. But beyond just, we call it apartheid because that's our legal diagnosis when we document the facts and apply the law. But I think there's a value in shifting the paradigm. I think there's a value in providing a framework of analysis for the growing intersectional movement. I think it raises the cost of the status quo. It adds a stigma. Claire again mentioned the kind of part of the impetus here is mutually hurting stalemate. And so you make it more costly, and you open up a set of human rights tools. And I know I have about 30 seconds in my 2 minutes. I have to say something. If our alternatives to Oslo panel is the Saudi-US normalization, we've learned nothing in this conference, right? If the idea is Palestinians who are dying of hunger, the breadcrumbs that come out of Saudi-US Saudi does not care about human rights. Read Human Rights Watch's reporting, including about the gunning down of Ethiopian migrants leaving the border, a report released 3 weeks ago, right? The US clearly, we just saw a visa waiver yesterday. They're very willing to put aside concerns about discrimination and human rights. We need to move beyond hoping that this is our way forward. And the way to do so is recognizing reality and taking a human rights-based approach.
Thanks, Omar. A question for you, Martin. Going back to your discussion of the US-Saudi dynamic, you made the case that the US is a key player in this and that the Saudis are making some very hefty demands of the US. And I'm just curious, what is the incentive for a Saudi-Israeli deal from a US perspective? Those are big asks that are potentially security risks for the US. Why should Biden go through with this and be willing to make those kinds of concessions? You're on mute again. Sorry, Martin.
Thank you. I'll get it eventually. I think to answer your question, you need to widen the lens to go out from our particular focus here on the Palestinian issue to what's at stake for the United States strategically in the region. And it begins with an understanding that the United States has to find a way to do more with less in the Middle East, because the priority of confronting Russian aggression in Europe and Chinese assertiveness in Asia leaves the United States with a deficit in terms of resources, attention, capabilities when it comes to dealing with the Middle East. And there's been a decided shift over 3 administrations in priorities away from the Middle East. And so the idea of an Israeli-Saudi peace deal on the strategic level is to bring together, to in effect form a strategic alliance, open one, between the militarily most powerful country in the region, that is Israel, and the economically most powerful country in the region, that is Saudi Arabia, and have them serve as the 2 anchors of an offshore balancing strategy by the United States. That's what's at stake here. In the process, the United States would not only commit itself to Saudi Arabia's defense in a way it's a little different from the way it's committed to Israel's defense, but still very much a kind of integrated approach to a security framework. But it would also put curbs on Saudi Arabia's relationship with China. As part of the deal for a defense treaty, there would be no Chinese military facilities allowed in Saudi Arabia, no shifting of denomination of Saudi oil sales out of US dollars into yuan or renminbi, no Chinese sensitive technologies in Saudi Arabia. So I think that's the much bigger picture. It's not really about the Palestinians itself. It's about a strategy for regional stability. So in that regard, it's quite possible to imagine that Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States could do this deal without anything significant for the Palestinians. I believe that that's not the approach that the administration is going to take for reasons I've already outlined. But there is a strategic justification which is driving this deal that has greater importance to all 3 players than the Palestinian issue.
Thanks. Aziz, one of the criticisms that has been leveled at the Abraham Business Accords, as you eloquently put it, is that there was no talk of the occupation. There was no talk of Palestinian rights. It was an afterthought. And I'm wondering if there is a way of framing the argument for normalization economically, an economic argument to be used against the occupation, to say that, yes, we want free-flowing trade, we want free flow of people, and that's impossible in a state that's littered with checkpoints that make it impossible for a Palestinian to go somewhere 3 miles from his or her home without going through multiple checkpoints and basically having movement limited by the Israeli state. Could it be framed differently, even if it's still on some level economic peace, but also take on the occupation head on?
Yeah. So thank you. So the first thing that I just wanted to say is that I'm in no at all. I am not talking about a little bit of crumbs for the Palestinian issue at all, and I argue against that, because I think any bit of crumbs or any even kind of concessions that is just for the sake of preserving a 2-state solution is another kick of the can down the road. And therefore, in conjunction with the preservation of this, there needs to be that facilitation. And that facilitation will come in an economic logic that you very much mentioned, that, you know, it's about low-hanging, if we talk about hanging fruits, you know, I've had meetings before, and a lot of people say, well, you know, let's think about this in an economic way. Let's try to address the situation, the occupation, in an economic way. And how about, you know, we could just facilitate Palestinian-Israeli cooperation for low-hanging fruits. And I remember thinking about this, and I stayed a long time thinking about this, and I said, you know, it sounds like a great idea, but why am I not convinced? And I think low-hanging fruits facilitates, or not, I'm sorry, low-hanging fruits is an adaptation to the occupation, not necessarily addressing the occupation. And I think when we try to link, I mean, we have now, when we try to, let me finish the point. When we link an economic vision, an economic Palestinian vision, with the other visions that are taking place in the region, such as Vision 2030. Every time when you look at Saudi Arabia, you see everything, everywhere is Vision 2030. But there's a Qatar 2030 vision. There's a Omani 2040 vision. Saudi Arabia is already talking about a Saudi 2040 vision. You know, and so if there is this paradigm that not seeks low-hanging fruits, but tries to go for the big fruits and say, listen, we have all these projects that we can get, but I can't really go there if it's a journey that takes me 5 minutes walk, takes me 3 hours to walk. And therefore it's going to, and I might not even get there. So I think where there is that rather than just focus on the principles and the ambiguities of something for the Palestinians, this is what I'm trying to say, is that no, I think what killed even the Oslo process, what even was something that undermined the Arab Peace Initiative, was the ambiguity. It was designed for facilitation of negotiations, but it just backfired, because that's the weakness of ambiguities. Rather, I think what is part of the facilitatory element of the Palestinian issue, or for the Palestinian issue here, is something explicit of creating, involving an infrastructure resulting from the Saudi-Israeli deal that will also help leverage the Abraham Accords that was supposedly for the Palestinian issue, which it wasn't. And they make it clear that it wasn't now. And then allow that kind of aspect to do the heavy lifting, but make sure they challenge the results to an investment. I mean, we need to think about investment in these areas, not necessarily charity. We're not thinking about charity. The region isn't involved in charity any longer. So and there's another aspect here, is that, well, we also have to talk about, well, what does a lack of a two-state solution mean for the region? And I am personally worried about this because, you know, as Ambassador Indek alluded to, that it's very explosive, and I'm afraid that this explosiveness can spill over to other things that will hinder this regional integration that's taking place. So I think that's my vision. And just to sum up this, is that this economic logic to be used is re-articulating the occupation from an economic lens, not necessarily, not in congruence with a human law lens, from a social lens, from an identity normal lens. So I think it's conjunction. It's not really a substitute for anything. It's supporting these things.
Thank you. And Claire, quickly, going back to your comment about who should be at the table, I'm just wondering, in terms of practical political steps to get some of the groups and organizations at the table that you rightly mentioned should be there, how do you get the Israelis to buy into that? How do you get the PA to give up its monopoly on being the negotiator for the Palestinian people and allow in some of these groups that are deeply critical of it or rivals to it?
Yeah, I mean, in other negotiations, I mean, there's no template, but in other negotiations, it's not for the Israelis to say who should be the Palestinians' negotiating delegation. That in itself can be a negotiation, but usually, you know, if you have a coalition delegation, look at Venezuela. In Venezuela, you have an opposition coalition. How did they choose it? They chose it through a series of votes and steps, and it wasn't the easiest thing, and Maduro has ended up accepting it. From the Palestinian side, it's a tougher call, but that's where we have, as the international community and the Arab states, leverage to say, fine, you guys, and this is what I mean about killing the zombie, to say, we have now come to a position of deciding that we do not see all of these institutions as necessarily sacrosanct. There's no sacred cows anymore. What we want to see is Palestinian aspiration reflected at the table in a way that we believe could deliver a peace agreement were it ever negotiated. Therefore, we invite you to have a discussion with us about how that's going to be done. And there are many, many templates. I just want to say really super quickly, because it is important, and we mentioned it in earlier. 2005, the second intifada, a child born then in Israel, a child born in Palestine. The Palestinian child is now turning 18, has only ever known the PA, only ever known Abu Mazen. There's never been any other leader. It's absolutely a lesson in why nothing can change. And equally for an Israeli child, they were born after the Intifada and they grew up now, and Itmar Ben-Gvir is running the country, essentially. So these young people have not had a chance to think that things could change. They've been brought up to believe that nothing can. It is really, really fundamental that they see, at least in the Palestinian side, the Israeli side, we have a separate conversation, that we are pushing vehicles for change.
Thanks. Now to the audience. We have 15 minutes. I'll start with taking 2 questions here in Brussels, and then if we could take 2 in DC. Yes, in the second row here. She's got a mic.
People want to raise their hands here, so I know.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, my name is Visa Buyupai. I am an MA student at Diplomacy and Global Governance from Brussels School of Governance. I do have a question more directed to Ambassador Vimon, but any other panelists could answer, and I would appreciate that. We mentioned taking into account the lessons learned and how EU has not been very active in the Middle East, specifically for the Palestine and Israel conflict. With the recent developments on the Kosovo and Serbia dialogue, which EU has been mediating for years, and in my opinion has not been successful towards finding a solution and has not shown neutrality, how would this affect the negotiation power of the EU in the Palestine and Israel solution? If the EU looks itself in the mirror, would it find itself competent and well prepared for a more complex situation like the Palestine and Israel conflict? Thank you.
Yeah, if you'd like to respond directly, since it was for you.
Very quickly. No, you're absolutely right. And just looking at the Kosovo example you gave, for me, the question is very simple. In 2013, we had a kind of roadmap ahead of us, and we didn't do anything for the next something like 6, 7, or 8 years. So it's a question of diplomats thinking that they can buy time, and buying time is the right recipe. It doesn't work. And you could say the same thing for the Middle East. And I think this is the kind of diplomatic lessons you have to learn. Time is not on your side, usually.
Thanks. Did we have another question? Well, you're right there, so.
Nozomi Takahashi from European Coordination for Committees and Association for Palestine. Well, I was just listening to some different opinion and proposition of the panelists. Probably not all of us agreed, but some panelists agreed. There are a few questions already posed in the previous session about what was Oslo really. Was it really a peace process? And I think many of you refuted it was not a peace process. It was maybe a smoke screen created to earn time. And this to earn time for whom? For Israel. In the meantime, they have built so much of settlement, expanded and annexed. And this was just going on for the sake of peace process. Everything was just suspended. There was no final agreement made. So we are thinking about, well, I think some panelists agreed that was success of Israel. It was not, it was success. It was not a failure. So having this reflection in mind, if I hear about what Abraham Accord will be, I feel it's like another smoke screen. And if it's not, I really want to hear your opinion. Why is it not a small screen? And where you are going. But I think I have to just make one thing clear, especially because you're mentioning about it's a business accord. Okay, but states, they are not the companies in pursuit of profit. States should have some ethics. States should have also certain obligation according to international law. So what's your opinion about this? international law dictates very clearly, like the UN Special Reporter Francesca yesterday has made it so clear, there's a glaring illegality about the practice of Israel. Why doesn't it get just a very normal diplomatic sanction for the member state who has obligation to prevent that? So this is my question. I want to hear your opinion.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to that, could I take the two questions in Washington, please? If there are.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you again for everything that's been expressed. We've been learning a lot today. It's been very valuable. Again, my name is Yahya Abu Zaid. I'm a student here at Georgetown, the Arab Studies program. My question is for Claire. With regards to negotiations and mediations, and we've been talking about who's at the table, I struggle to see how the PA would be able to represent the Palestinian side in any way, even when we talk about future negotiations and bringing in other actors like China, India. That seems to be a stumbling block getting in the way of anything. Do you see a future where the PA would reform in some way and be a positive actor? Or do we need to envision a new entity that would be able to be at the talks?
We have one more question here.
Hello, my name is Shai Hazkani. I'm a historian of Palestine, Israel from the University of Maryland. Thank you for this panel and for this conference. I think in this panel, we heard at least two perspectives about what the future may hold. One by Aziz El-Ghashian, the other by Omar Shaker. Now, Aziz said something that we've heard before, that perhaps Arab states will, quote, will come and solve in some ways the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we have seen from many, many decades, starting in 48 and later, that usually doesn't play out in that way. While I think that, Saudi-Israeli normalization may be more than crumbs, in the sense that Saudi may give hundreds of millions to a Palestinian authority and prevent what seems now as an inevitable collapse, that will essentially be the realization of this quote unquote economic peace that Netanyahu, for example, have been talking about for 20 years, but probably not actual change in the ground in any way. But I was actually more surprised in some ways by Omar comments, and I want to push him to give us a little bit more than what is, he's a Human Rights Watch, and so of course that's what they do, and they do amazingly. But is there a constellation now in 2023 that may suggest that human rights and international law may create some sort of a change on the ground that was not the case a decade or two ago, with the current actors, with Ukraine, with Russia, with what we know about the major flaws of the international law or international, laws of occupation and definition, all of that, all the flaws of this? Do you think that there is a true feasibility for a future that may be somewhat better?
Okay, some of the questions were directed at specific people. So Claire, would you like to answer the question that was directed specifically at you?
I mean, I wish I had a really simple answer, and I'm just going to say that can the PA represent the Palestinian people's aspirations legitimately? No. Can you just pick them up and kick them out and replace them with other people arbitrarily? No. So the dilemma of every peace process always is you have imperfect leaders who are often autocratic. How do you embed them within a system that is fairer, that is more representative, and how do you use leverage to do that? It's not easy, and yeah, they're absolutely an obstacle, and most Palestinians would love to see him go. I blame the Mediterranean diet. They hang on for a long, long time. Anyway, that's very unfair. But yeah, so you have to embed them in a system that is fairer. Just arbitrarily kicking them out or it is not going to create the kind of fair representation at the table that you are looking for.
Omar, would you like to respond both to the question here in Brussels about accountability for Israel and diplomatic accountability, as well as the question there in DC that was directed to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, the struggle for accountability is a universal one. I represented men detained in Guantanamo, still men detained in Guantanamo. I worked on mass killings of protesters in Egypt. The person who, one of the people who orchestrated it, has been the president of Egypt for many years now. So it's a struggle we face. And I think the important point to underscore is law and human rights. And this is an answer that I can't give at the end of a day and a half conference. It's a tool, right? And I think that we can acknowledge the normative power of law. Take settlements. Despite Israel's every single effort and expansion, 56 years later, basically no country in the world recognizes settlements as legitimate. So even though we failed to stop as a human rights movement, when I say we, the expansion of settlements, the normative power is there. Our challenge, and again, we know what power is, we know what's happening, global trends, authoritarian rise, an attack on knowledge, truth, but it's a tool and we have to use it because we have no alternatives. I can't promise it's going to, in politics, as Moeen noted, even with the ICC, these dynamics are there. You can't assume law is going to give you the answer, but we have to use it as a tool. And the last thing I'll just say in terms of linking the Saudi normalization is here's an alternative way to think about, and I'll just posit this and I'll end on it, which is we think about Saudi-US normalization. But I want to think about it from a movement-based perspective, which is, for historically, Arab activists have always believed, I think, we need to deal with Palestine, then we'll deal with our authoritarian regimes. There was a shift in the Arab Spring where many people said, all right, let's fix our houses in Egypt, in Syria, and Libya. And that has largely, we know where we are right now. But now, actually, the linkage, people know if you want to challenge repression in Saudi Arabia, you might actually need to go back to dealing with Palestine. So I actually think there's this unique moment where we can make those connections and struggles between different areas. At the end of the day, these are normalization agreements between states that are repressive, that don't care about the human rights of their own people. So how can we expect them to take a stake in the human rights of another people? So ultimately, if we can think in that kind of creative way about a human rights-based opposition to this, or about movements and the connections between them, that the path to human rights in Saudi Arabia may come through dealing with the question of dismantling apartheid. I think that's the way we need to think.
Thank you. Aziz, there was a question touching on the economic peace arguments you were making. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think just a little bit quickly. I doubt that what I'm trying to say is perhaps what Netanyahu's tried to say, or the out-in approach, in my opinion. I think that the out-in approach kind of evolved for a while, in my opinion. The out-in before was, well, it was a political issue. It was, well, let's normalize there, and then they will then convince these Arab states that have normalized relations with Israel, will then somehow convince Palestine to accept something with Israel. And I think if that had worked, they would have done that ages ago. But the reality is that won't work. And I think that economic aspect is actually not new. This isn't Netanyahu. This is when Netanyahu was still probably a spokesperson in the US. This is under a Carter administration that Israel has been trying to actually do this kind of economic relationship, working on water security, etc. So in my opinion, what I think Netanyahu was trying to do was more of an isolatory aspect, not a facilitatory aspect. And I think this is the difference here, is that I think what we need to really invest in is really the facilitation and the linkage between these deals, between this deal and, what this anchorage, as Martin Indyk is saying. But, again, it's not about isolation. It is intimately bound and connected, and it has to be explicitly mentioned. Not really about principles, not Liz Truss economics somehow, it will eventually happen later on. No, we're talking about this has to take place, and it has to be channeled in the right place and the right space. Hence why the preservation of the two-state solution and preserving actual physical space for this to happen. So that's my opinion on this.
Thanks. We have time for a very quick last question. The gentleman in the front row here, yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for fascinating discussions. I have a question for Martin Indyk. Sir, exactly 20 years ago, you published in Foreign Affairs a detailed proposal for a UN Security Council mandate trust for Palestine to overcome the political crisis 3 years into the Second Intifada, and as an alternative strategy a decade post-Oslo. I know very well that today's situation is very different, but taking into consideration the current one-state reality and ongoing political crisis in Palestine, and now also in Israel, with the real prospect of Israel sliding into a full-fledged civil war and the likelihood of the Israeli nuclear codes sooner rather than later coming in the hands of people like Smotrich or Ben-Gvir. Under those circumstances, do you believe the idea of a UN trust is worth revisiting, and if so, in what form? And if not, how should, in your view, the US respond to the risks that I just mentioned?
Thank you. Martin.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Hooray. Well, thank you for that question. You know, it's an idea that has time passed and has not yet come again. But if you had a collapse of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and we're not that far from it, then the question is, who will rule there? Obviously, there are some in Israel who would be happy to take over the West Bank again from the Palestinian Authority. There are some, like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, that are seeking to undermine the Palestinian Authority so as to be able to take control of the whole area from the river to the sea. But others in Israel will be very troubled by the idea of taking control again of 3.5 million Palestinians beyond the military occupation, actually taking control of their lives, which the Palestinian Authority is responsible for now. So it's possible that in those circumstances, you could see the idea of some third party coming in to take control, overseeing an election process, establishing a new kind of form of government for the Palestinians. May seem far-fetched now, but in extremis might become relevant. Same thing with Gaza. If Hamas, if the truce essentially between Israel and Hamas breaks down, you have another major conflagration there. Israel is faced with going in and destroying Hamas, which it usually confronts that dilemma and decides not to do that. But if it does go in, then it has to face the question of who does it withdraw from Gaza in favor of? Doesn't want to stay there, doesn't want to extend its occupation beyond the West Bank back to Gaza again. They already left. So it's possible in that context that a third-party role for the UN could come up where, again, trusteeship could be established. Israel withdraws in favor of that. Again, you reconstitute a Palestinian governing institution and have elections for it. Sounds very far-fetched at the moment, but it will really depend on a major crisis, collapse of the Palestinian Authority, major confrontation in Gaza, where the idea might come around again.
Thank you, Ambassador Indyk, and thank you to all our panelists. We've now reached the end of our two-day conference, and thank you, Sasha, for navigating us through this last session. I'm not even going to try to sum up what's been talked about over 2 days. We will make the recordings available, and so that should be ample resources for everyone, I hope. What I will do is share my sincere thanks, first of all, to my ECFR colleagues, Elsa and Kelly, to our VTC technicians who are with us here in Brussels, without whom this would not at all be possible. Of course, to our counterparts in Washington, to the Middle East Institute, and the whole support team, Faria, Elliot, Scott, Nadine, Serena, Megan, Ben, Zach, and Zara. Hopefully I didn't forget anyone. But most of all, thank you to my co-convener, Khalid Al-Gindi. It's been quite an intense few weeks, and very happy to have been able to work with him to make this possible. And I think the outcome is something we can all be proud of. But above all, a massive thanks to all the participants, to the moderators we've had over the last 2 days, and of course to you, the public participants who've been with us in person in Brussels, in Washington, and online. We very much look forward to having you again with us in the future. Thank you.